This episode, I'm joined once again by writer John Michael Greer to discuss his book, The Spirit and the Sword, and Gerard Thibault's book, The Academy of the Sword, alongside discussions on Jung, Reich, Reichenbach, sacred geometry, the body, and more. I'd like to wish all my followers, subscribers, listeners, and patrons a Merry Christmas. And if you've enjoyed anything I've made this year and would like to support the podcast and gain access to some exclusive content, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, John Michael Greer, thanks once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on again.
So,
it's a pleasure.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to get out of the way at the start. First is that this will be the Christmas Day special, so it should be Christmas Day when I put this out. So, Merry Christmas and season's greeting to everyone.
Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas. There we go.
I believe you've done that every time we've done a Christmas special. And
I probably have, yes.
Yeah.
It's one of those basic things. I don't really know what a Krampus voice should sound like, so,
We don't have the Krampus in the UK, so I'm not... I've heard of it.
You need to import him, good heavens. What's going to terrify children and make sure they actually behave themselves?
We have the other American import, the Elf on a Shelf, the CCTV
okay,
version. Yeah, that is terrifying. The panopticon of Christmas. So
he sees you when you're sleeping. Yeah.
Exactly. So we're going to be talking about, oddly, because these two books are from, I've read a lot of your work, we've done a lot of interviews, I've listened to a lot of your other interviews, and these are the two that don't come up as often. So there's two books here, The Spirit and the Sword, a Western Way of Swordsmanship, which was 2008, published 2008, and then there is, I'm going to mispronounce this, Gerard Thibault, or Thibault?
Very close, yes. I have no capacity for pronouncing French, so we will take that as given.
Gerard Thibault, The Academy of the Sword, and this was translated, I'm assuming the translation took a long time, but this was translated, published out in 2016. Now, there's one thing I have to say, which is a big thank you to a listener who goes by the name of TC, because this book is extremely difficult to get in the UK, and I was fortunate enough to have a listener actually send me a copy, so a big thank you to talking about swordsmanship, talking about, in a way, the body, physicality. There's a couple of questions I've noted down, which actually, when I was researching this stuff and reading your work, I thought, man, these are absolutely gigantic questions, as per usual.
Good.
But there's also another question I want to ask you, because someone said to me, I think this is like our 12th interview, and they said, if you can think back to 4 years ago, the first question I ever ask guests is the Hermitix question. And someone said, well, you've had Greer on so many times, you should re-ask him it and see if it's changed. So I don't know if you remember this, but if you could place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation, who would you pick?
Good heavens, that's an interesting challenge. I'm sure it will be a different set than the ones that I had in mind last time, because I would want... Who would I want if I were to put three thinkers? One of them would be William Butler Yeats. I've been doing a lot of Yeats study recently, and of course he was a fascinating man to listen to under almost any circumstances. Let's see. Another one would be, and again, I'm going to pick them for my current interests. Karl von Reichenbach, the brilliant, I believe it was German rather than Austrian, but don't quote me on that, scientist and chemist who played a very large role in attempting to discover the life force, one of those very common mistakes that scientists make that gets them cast out of the science. This is the guy who discovered paraffin. Okay, he made himself a multimillionaire with chemical discoveries in the fields of dyes and all this kind of stuff, and then he started paying attention to the life force, and of course he got written out of all the books, and everyone just rolled their eyes and turned their backs. Not the first time that's happened, nor the last. But I would love to hear what von Reichenbach would have to say. And then for the third one, Giambattista Vico, the Italian historian, mostly a historian of rhetoric and law, who was the first great author in the modern Western tradition of a theory of a cycle of history. And he had some remarkable things to say about it. His book is almost unreadable by moderns. The New Science, as it's called, is almost unreadable by modern standards because it's written in the style of the Renaissance. Most of us aren't used to that, but he has some amazing things to say. And yeah, for today's Hermitix meeting, yes, I would break that out and have appropriate beverages for all, and then just sit there and listen to the talk.
So just just 4 years ago, it was Iamblichus, Fortune, and Nietzsche. So there's been some changes. There's been some changes.
Yes, I mean that would be a great conversation too.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think this conversation between Yeats, Reichenbach, and Vico would go? Who do you think would take the stage?
I think Yeats always tended to kind of hog the stage a bit, but you see, I think he would be because historical cycles were of great interest to him. He would be very interested in what Vico had to say. I don't know if he actually read Vico. I don't know I don't know how good his Italian was, because I don't think it had been translated yet. And von Reichenbach, from everything I gather from him, was a very, very polite, very courtly gentleman, and he would have had a grand old time. So I don't know ultimately if anybody would have taken the stage, whether it would have been this sort of roundabout, boiling over cauldron of conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a strange coincidence because Reichenbach may come back in, not specifically, but the idea of a life force is most definitely going to come back in. And this is something that's fascinating me at the moment, especially the Western appreciation, or as you said, the Western neglect. You know, another figure that I'm oddly also very interested in the moment is not Reichenbach, but Reich, who also did exactly the same thing, found the quote-unquote life force, and then
yes. Although he did not have the great good fortune to be immensely wealthy and, of course, a German nobleman, because von Reichenbach was a count, I think, or no, he was a baron, excuse me. But he was a high-ranking nobleman. You couldn't simply just throw him into prison for discovering the wrong thing. Reich was not so fortunate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I guess, beginning with this idea, because the swordsmanship was almost secondary to what is it we're really talking about here, which is the body, and at foundation, actually, it's the big question of the connection between spirit and matter, which I'll get to. But before we do so, as I said, this topic isn't as touched upon by you, but you've obviously written and practiced it a lot. So I understand that you obviously practice swordsmanship, but you also the martial art you mostly practice Tai Chi, I believe.
That's correct. Tai Chi
yeah.
Chuan.
So are those your two main forms of, we could say, very clear physical practice, which has a spiritual
it's
component?
more complex than that. Many years ago, in my teens, I actually studied Hatha Yoga for an extended period. And then I got into Tai Chi, and I've kind of moved in and out of various modes of engagement with Tai Chi for some years. Then I got involved. I started chasing Western swordsmanship. In there, I also practiced Aikido for a while. And I got involved in Western swordsmanship, first of all, through the sort of fragmentary system that I talk about in The Spirit and the Sword. Then I ran across the Thibault's manuscript and slowly translated that over a period of almost a decade, and worked with people who were involved in the revival of Western martial arts, who knew about rapier fencing and so on. And then, in the course of that, realizing that I really did need some solid grounding in a martial art, I got involved with a Tai Chi school in Seattle and practiced Tai Chi for a great many years, and about a decade all told. And there, and also in Ashland, where one of my Seattle teacher's main students had moved to Ashland and opened a school of his own, Ashland, Oregon, I should say. And then, then I kind of got involved in some other things at that point, with less of a focus on exercise. I practiced the 5 rites, also known as the 5 Tibetans, for a while, and also a kind of a system more or less derivative from Tai Chi called Tai Chi Chi, or Tai Chi, depending on how you pronounce it. Various people give it different spins. And I've done all kinds of stuff.
So what I noticed about these forms of quote unquote martial arts, which you've taken up, the reason I put that in quotation marks is these are forms which don't have the emphasis, say, with certain types of karate or other things, which is to do with hostility in a way of attack and defense. These have a greater emphasis on some force.
Well, and again, that varies. Thibault's rapier system has no reference to life force at all.
Mm-hmm.
It is remarkably similar to Aikido in some ways, and we can get to that in the discussion. But whether the life force spiritus, as it was called in Latin in those days, whether that was part of the practice, it didn't go into Thibault's book at all. He is entirely focused on the mind, focused on geometry. And his system is also, the normal end of a rapier duel was one or both people dropped dead. was not a gentle instrument, and he focused on the basic end for one of the sequences in Thibault's book is that somebody gets killed. Mm-hmm. So attack and defense, oh yeah. But the other things, the other practices, the other martial and quasi-martial practices that I got into, yeah, they're much more focused on the life force, on an energy that bridges the gap between what we call spirit and matter.
Mm. So why the interest in swordsmanship then?
Partly because I was a geeky child who read lots of trashy fantasy novels. Mm. The idea of brandishing a sword had a very strong emotional charge for me. Growing up on Tolkien and all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Partly because when I stumbled across the fragmentary system of swordsmanship that I ended up assembling into a complete system for spirit and the sword, it was a system of swordsmanship and not of something else. Mm-hmm. When I ran across a book that combined martial arts and sacred geometry, Thibault's manuscript, that also was a book of swordsmanship and not something else. If it had been a system of wrestling, I would have written about that instead. Mm-hmm. But that was what came up. Now, it probably didn't hurt that the Tai Chi style that I practice also includes two different techniques for two different varieties of sword. So, but I also learned the short staff and a few other things.
Mm-hmm. Do you still practice anything almost as part of your routine, if you don't mind me asking?
These days, I've been doing a range of other things for a while. I was working on a system of physical exercise that kind of connects to the prehistory of the five rites, which I mentioned a moment ago. I'm also, these days, I kind of cycle in and out between doing experimental things like that and doing Tai Chi Chu, the kind of thing derived from Tai Chi that I mentioned, which is not really martial and does not have weapons.
Okay.
It's more suitable for my needs these days.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess to build up this sort of foundation to draw in a lot of interconnecting elements, there's a couple of questions I would ask, which is, mm-hmm. one, what is the importance of a connection to the body for any sort of what we might consider spiritual growth? And then second mm-hmm. to that is, what would you consider the current, as we are in this climate, Western relationship with the body to be? And if you're probably in agreement with me that we neglect it, why do you think it is that we have a massive mm-hmm. neglect of our bodies?
Question number one, what is or should be the connection between body arts and spiritual practices? That really depends on what kind of spiritual practice you're engaged in. If you are deeply committed to Christian mysticism, you probably don't need much body work, because that's very much focused on the body that matters there is the glorified body of the resurrection, which you will have, at such point as God gives it to you. You do need a certain amount of capacity to spend long hours on your knees in prayer, but other than that, there's not a lot of physical dimension. There are other modes of spiritual practice that require a great deal. It depends on to what extent you want to integrate the physical body into your spiritual disciplines. The physical body is a tool. It is the material expression of our life in matter, if you will, and it can be used in various ways. It can be used in some very flexible and constructive ways, or some very simple ways. Take your pick. But it's one of the tools in the toolbox. And some traditions use a lot of it. Some use very little. The Western world has had a very problematic relationship to physical incarnation for a very long time. And you see this in several different ways. On the one hand, the sort of neglect and even loathing of the body that you get on the one hand in some varieties of Christian mysticism. On the other hand, these what's the transhumanist people who are babbling on about uploading their consciousness to perfect robot bodies and all this kind of drivel. And it's based on a loathing of matter. There's a kind of Gnostic element here. The idea that being material, having a body, is entrapment. We're stuck. We're imprisoned in matter, and we have to, flee from this horrible material world to this, abstract world of light. Whether that is, an other world on the far side of death, or whether it's a bit of bad science fiction that Yuval Harari and people like that have gotten obsessed with after too many bong hits or something. That's I suppose if that's what matters, if that's what works for you, that's what works for you. It seems profoundly stupid to me. If you accept the idea that there is a divine presence or divine presences, God or gods, who have created the world and put us in it, and they are not, evil Gnostic archons who are cackling over their, are being imprisoned in matter, presumably we have bodies for a good reason. And we have this tool, we have this amazing tool with its strengths and its limitations to work with. As a druid, I don't find embodiment in matter to be particularly imprisoning. I don't find it to be a horrible burden, blah, blah, blah. I actually rather enjoy it. And that being the case, maybe we can get good at it. Maybe we can learn how to use this tool a little better. But that is not the way the Western world has thought for the last 2,000 years.
2,000?
Oh, yeah. Since basically, not just by way of Christianity. If you read back in sort of late Greek philosophy, there's that same, distrust of the body, the loathing of the terror of sex, sexuality. Oh my God, what is this horrible thing between my legs and where is it dragging me? You find that as often in late pagan literature as you do in early Christian literature, but it was something that seized the imagination of a large part of the Western world. About 2 millennia ago, and it remains in place. You have that notion that material existence is a vale of tears. It's a horrible place to be stuck in a body. I mean, the three enemies of the Christian are the world, the flesh, and the devil. So your own physical embodiedness is equal to Satan as your enemy. That's what the tradition has. That's what the tradition says. It seems crazy to me, but that's the way the Western world has thought for a very long time.
What's the alternative?
The alternative is, again, to assume that we have bodies for a very good reason. It's not for punishment. It's to look at bodies, as something that, as a tool, as an instrument, as a mode of our being in the world. Schopenhauer argues that the body is the form of our will. The body is the expression of our will in the grade of matter. And so it's essential to who and what we are at this phase of our being. Whatever comes afterwards, here and now, interacting with the body, working with the body, learning through the body, is essential to health, to spiritual health as well as physical health.
Even though you place it at, obviously roughly 2,000 years ago, do you see René Descartes, the mind-body split as sort of really solidifying and bolstering this attitude of, the mind, the great seat of reason, and then the body, and that other thing that we have,
Well, the thing is, he was just rehashing stuff that had been said in other language, in a more theological language for centuries before his time. Normally, all that happens when an age of reason breaks out, as Descartes was at the cutting edge of that, all that happens is that the basic religious ideas of a culture get pulled out of context, they have their serial numbers filed off, and they get presented as rational deductions rather than as theological revelations. So the same mentality that led medieval saints to wear, shirts of haircloth and treasure their lice, and mortify the flesh, sometimes in hideous ways. You see that intellectualized in Descartes and his successors, where the mind and the body. What is this? What is this scummy thing that has gotten somehow hooked to my intellect? Them dragging along the way of, the car from, the husband and wife just married have the tin cans rattling behind it.
What, I guess to take that idea of the mind-body split, I mean, what's your own appreciation of what that is? I mean, obviously it's not going to be the dualist split. Is it just something more holistic, where consciousness is seated? What do you see that as
okay.
being?
The first thing that I do in talking about the mind-body split is to relativize it by noting that we are more than a mind and a body. There is the mind, there is the body, there are various other things. In Western occult spirituality, we talk about different bodies. We have the physical body, the body of matter. We have the etheric body, the body of life force. We have the astral body, which is the body of imagination and concrete consciousness and so on. And these things form a spectrum, if you will. It's not, here's the mind, there's the body, and there's this vast gaping gulf between them. That is the thing that Descartes brought in more than anything else, the pretense that there's nothing in between, that the life force does not exist, that consciousness only exists as this little bubble of abstraction, that we don't have the kind of vivid, sensate, imaginal consciousness that we all in fact do. And so one starts by seeing this as a spectrum, not as a dualism. And as a spectrum that goes up beyond mind, by the way. The mind as we know it is a fairly basic model. You know, so I don't know if it's quite 1.0, but it's not much past 1.1 or maybe 1.12. There are many modes of consciousness that rise far higher up that particular scale than we have ever gotten to. That, again, is something out of Western occult tradition. And so once you put it in that context, it stops being this war of mind and body. It becomes, okay, here are these two among many parts of the self. And we can start integrating them. We can start looking at the mind and saying, okay, here's this capacity for abstract thought that we have. Neat. We can do neat things with it. It's not the be-all and end-all. Here's this capacity for vivid, sensate, imaginal, concrete thought that we have, where we can dream and we can envision and we can have these experiences. We can feel. Here's these emotions. That's a world in and of itself. Here's the world of the life force. Here's the world of breath and of prana and chi and all those things, and orgone, and all these things, which are all pretty much the same thing, that are not supposed to exist, that have been forbidden from existing by a lot of well-paid scientists, and that nonetheless still refuse to go away, and that form a constant part of our environment. And then we have this material dimension to ourselves, this material dimension to the world of our experience, and we interact with that also. So we have all these different things to play with. We have all these different tools to use. And rather than getting in a fuss about whether this one is better than that one or that one is better than this one, well, what do you want to do?
So
you don't use a saw to hammer nails, and you don't use a hammer to saw boards. Okay, you use your material body for some things, and so on. But go on.
Well, I was going to say, do you see then the reason why we've become so averse, other than a lot of money behind it, usually become, especially in the West, so averse to chi, prana, life force, orgone, whatever it may be, is because ultimately at that point you have to accept something where reason is no longer the complete controller of it, so perhaps we aren't the center of all things again. So brush that aside and carry on.
That's an important part of it. That's a very important part of it, that, if once you accept the idea of the spectrum, you realize that the mind is not at one end. The mind is actually more or less at the middle. And there are many things above that. And of course, the great typical feature of Western industrial consciousness is this crackpot delusion that we are the summit of evolution, we are the most important thing that ever was, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. Please. There's another part to it, though, which is actually one of those places where history influences consciousness very powerfully. In the process by which the scientific revolution was accepted into Western societies, Descartes' little act of erasure, his insistence that there's dead matter and then there's abstract mind and nothing in between, please, that was a compromise that could be accepted between the religious establishment and the rising capitalist, or in those days mercantilist classes of the 17th century. Because you had that, of course, in Britain, you had the English Civil War and all these minor little problems, and equivalent events in other places where the church lost its control over the intellectual life of society, it lost its control over the economic life of society, but it could not simply be abolished, not yet. It took things like the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution ultimately to do that, but it had to let go of a large section of its control. And so how do we divide the spoils between the church, which can't simply be eliminated, and the rising mercantilist, ultimately capitalist classes? You do it along the lines of mind and matter. You give education and the intellectual life over to the church. You keep material life, economic life in the hands of the rising classes. You draw a hard line between them. Isaac Newton played an important role in that. In setting up a world in which, a sort of two-story world, in which, yes, there's action at a distance. Yes, there's this mysterious thing called gravity, and we can use that to justify the claim that there are other, mysterious forces, but they are perfectly mathematical. They are perfectly rational. They all belong to this one narrow category, which we call mind. And then everything else is just lumps of matter bumping into each other in the void. And we handed that over to the capitalist classes. And so that division, the splitting of the spoils in the 17th and 18th centuries in European culture, ended up becoming a template. That political and economic division became a cultural and ultimately cognitive template that was imposed for centuries thereafter on Western thinking. I have an article in one of my books of essays called The Historical Origins of the Mind-Body Problem that talks about this in great detail and explains how it was that a compromise between elite classes in conflict got turned into the basic cognitive template that we have as human beings in the Western world.
Mm-hmm. And what's really lost in that is this it's a very rough approximation of a large idea, but what's lost in that is this life force. And what sort of I guess we sort of touched on it a little bit, but what sort of societal symptoms do you see, especially in the way people think, once not only is that pushed aside, but it's just assumed as not even a thing, doesn't exist?
Yeah. We erase the entire idea. You can't get rid of it. It keeps on boiling back up, whether in the form of alternative medicine or popular culture, the Force. What are we talking about in this Star Wars cliche anyway? We're talking about the life force. And so it's all over the place, but nobody, we don't talk about it as a reality. We have to pretend that it's not real. On the one hand, this enables the delusion that we can plan the world. Or specifically, we is one of those very touchy, very, very evasive words here, that members of the elite classes, members of the privileged classes can plan the world and have it obey. Because if the world is nothing but dead matter, lumps of dead matter bumping into each other in the void, then it has to do what it's told, right? If there's a life force, if there's a continuum, if the force is with you or not with you, as the case may be, maybe not. And we see this same sort of top-down fantasy of control pervasive. We see it in medicine. Most modern medicine is an attempt to tell the body what to do. You're going to bludgeon it with surgery. You're going to bludgeon it with drugs. You're going to shove it this way and that way. And the mere fact that the body responds homeostatically, that it doesn't just react, it responds, it adjusts, is an endless frustration to the medical industry, because no matter what they do, the body won't behave like a lump of dead matter. And adding insult to injury, you have all of these, strange crackpots like Wilhelm Reich who are healing people of serious illnesses using something that does not and cannot exist and must not exist, and we won't talk about the fact that it works. So, it's part of this whole sort of dualism of late industrial society, where everything is divided into, abstract mind and dead matter, where our society is supposedly divided into the smart people, the managerial class, the good people who know what to do and tell everyone else what to do, and everyone else should just follow orders. They don't. They know better. They know that the people on top are actually clueless, that they're living in an imaginary world of their own construction and trying to make it behave, and it's not behaving. So we end up with all of these squabbles and conflicts where the managerial classes are shrieking in outrage because the world will not abide by their orders. The life force is part of that. The life force is a large part of what we call intuition. The life force is a lot of what feeds into collective consciousness, the fact that people will sense the vibes of something, to use the terminology of a vanished decade, and maybe act in response to that, or maybe back away. It's because we don't accept the existence of the life force, because we as a culture pretend that the life force doesn't exist, the imaginal realm doesn't exist, the whole vast space between abstract mind and dead matter doesn't exist, then we end up making so many stupid mistakes and creating so many self-inflicted problems.
I guess just as a very quick digression, do you see then Reich's orgone just basically as him as someone who couldn't go the whole hog and admit that it was, it was a spiritual thing, because he would adhere to the fact that it has nothing to do with, quote unquote, the occult, right?
Yeah, well, Reich's his story was such a tragedy, because here he is. He's coming out of a very hardcore materialist background. He's a Marxist, for heaven's sakes. He could only see religion and occultism as obscurantism, as these bizarre fictional narratives created by a ruling class to impose their will on the world. And yet, he was honest in his research. He started studying. He was a psychologist. He was a medical doctor who got into Freudian psychotherapy and who studied sex and became really focused on understanding sex, and that led him step by step to understanding that there's something that is exchanged between bodies when they have sexual relations, and it's not something that's quite physical as we know it. And of course, it just unfolded from there. But he could never avail himself of the resources of the traditions the Western world has, which, on the one hand, could have given him the guidance he needed to put his work into a broader context, and on the other hand, could have given him fair warning of what kind of mess he was walking into.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, he walked straight into it and died in prison.
Yeah, but I think in a way because he didn't have that openness to understand religion and the mystical sincerely, it's probably a complete naivety on his part to think that anything was going to happen. Well, if we're all being sincere scientists, then you will just take my research at face value, right? I think it was almost a childlike naivety of scientists actually do adhere to the scientific method, and then the sudden realization that no, they don't.
They don't. And in fact, if he had been open to looking at what happened to Mesmer, if he was open to looking at what happened to Reichenbach, or dozens of others, he would have gone, oh boy, I guess I need to be a little more evasive about this. I need to be a little more careful, not to keep off the radar screens of the medical industrial complex and the state. And he would have lived out his life, and heaven knows what he would have accomplished.
Yeah. And of course, the man who did that almost to a degree unfathomable, but of course the cat's out of the bag now. Carl Jung, I've got to hand it to him.
Oh yeah.
I don't know I don't know how he managed to hide the fact he was just literally a magician for all those years.
The guy was an occultist, but no, Jung was smart. Jung was whip smart. He understood what happens to people who stray too far. He knew that. I don't happen to know that he was. I don't recall reading any discussion in print of his writings of Reichenbach and Mesmer and so on. But the fact is, he knew his way around the occult movement of his time. He knew it. He was exquisitely attuned to it. He studied astrology. He studied alchemy. He was in contact with people who knew this stuff. And so, he very clearly figured out, okay, I can get away with this. I can talk about the gods as long as I claim they're archetypes internal to the human mind. I can talk about talismans as long as I insist that they have to be done spontaneously as a product of the unconscious. And he is great. I'm hoping now that depth psychology is really losing its grip in what's left of its grip in the medical profession. I'm hoping that Jung's thought really gets picked up by occultists and people do things with it, because it's a great system of occult philosophy. And I think once the necessary camouflage is scrubbed off, I think it could become a major resource for the occultists of the next 1,000 years or so.
Is there any other major figures who you feel are also hiding behind camouflage and you really see as just magicians? Or occultists?
Well, you have to go back a little ways. Isaac Newton comes to mind. The stuff that he did that revolutionized physics, that was what he did on weekends to relax.
Mm-hmm.
He was mostly interested in alchemy.
Mm.
He was a very good alchemist. We have some of his lab notes. Betty Jo Teeter Dobbs some years ago, did 2 books on basically working with his lab notebooks of alchemy and saying, wow, so he accomplished all of these various stages of the alchemical work. And, oh, wow, we don't know what to make of this, but we're actually going to talk about it. He's one that comes immediately to mind. There's this very funny, unintentionally funny essay by John Maynard Keynes talking about Newton as the last of the magicians.
Yeah, Keynes would wish. Yeah, Keynes is the absolute person who would wish for that.
No, everybody thought. I mean, the delusion that magic packed up and went away. That if you just yell about rationalism enough, all the mages will just kind of slink away into the night. It's very widespread. I've been having a lot of fun recently looking at. Oh, come on! I'm going to freeze on his name. The Disenchantment of the World.
Weber?
Yeah, Max Weber. The spirit, the Protestant spirit, and the Protestant, whatever it is, in the spirit of capitalism. And the thing is, as what was it? Jason Josephson Storm pointed out in his recent book, The Myth of Disenchantment, that Weber knew occultists. He knew people that when he was writing this, he was hanging out with people who were practicing magic. The world had not been disenchanted at all. What he was doing was not descriptive, prescriptive. He was saying, well, the world ought to be disenchanted. We ought to experience the world this way, even though, this is in Germany in the early 20th century. It was crawling with occultists. And most people had at least dabbled. And so you have this whole thing, this whole pretense that magic doesn't exist anymore, that we've outgrown that, even though, I mean, one of the stats that I love quoting to people is right now in America today, more people make their living as astrologers than as astronomers by a significant number.
It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
So there's, I guess, moving into the swordsmanship, but there's one sort of question that I think is actually, it's connected to what we've spoken about so far, with this foundation with the body, because with the swordsmanship we will have this sacred geometry, so possibly not life force in a sense, but there is this sacred connection to the sacred, right? Now, one thing that I think is so important always to emphasize with regard to bodily work of any sort, and I think this does apply to the swordsmanship, is the idea of relaxation. So in the West, I've, as you might have been able to tell, I've been reading a lot of Reich lately, and the more I read Reich, the more I've been reading Reich, the more I walk around and see, wow, everyone is a
character armor, gosh.
Yeah, everyone is quite literally, you go up to them with a knitting needle and like pierce this sort of veil of tension. Like everyone is so tense. And with respect to pretty much any, I practiced Shotokan karate quite a while ago, and I've done other various bodily things, blah, 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 or forms with the body, whatever you want to call it. The one of the first lessons you learn is when you put your arm out straight, or if they say put your arm out at a horizontal or a vertical, the way to do that fully is you actually have to learn to relax. And so my question really is, why can't we relax?
Partly because of that same gap between mind and body. We insist that the body is supposed to just obey the mind. We don't get into that imaginal space, into that vital life force space, which is where relaxation can happen. Instead, we're constantly sort of sitting, as though we're sitting in an imaginary driver's seat, trying to make the body lurch forward along its routines. Most of us don't even feel how tense we are, because we've cut those ties of communication. We've numbed ourselves, and that's inherent in the culture. That's inherent in this whole flight from matter. If you don't enter into your embodiment, if you don't feel the life force in yourself, if you don't feel your own body clearly, then tensions pile up, because you never just let them go. Also, of course, right now, as industrial society continues along the arc of its decline, people generally have a lot to be stressed out about. And if they don't know how to relax, they don't know how to just take a moment or more than a moment and unwind and let go of that tension, it's going to pile up.
And what worries me with that is the forms of relaxation that we're being given. Well, not myself, but a lot of people who have been part of quote normal culture. The new corporate mindfulness that's you look at the statistic of that, it's turning out to be far more dangerous, because ultimately it's almost like a bodily form of Stockholm syndrome. It's like, here's how to relax within a situation which is actually very stressful and harmful to you, and that's dangerous.
It's simply a slightly less chemical form of tranquilizer. And the thing that I would point out is that mindfulness meditation, as it has been marketed, not as it is in its original setting in Theravada Buddhism, it's part of a whole system. It's one exercise out of many. It has a very powerful use in that context. Pulled out of context, turned into this corporate schlock, it doesn't actually relax you. It teaches you not to notice how tense you are, because you just let these thoughts and perceptions go whistling off in the wind, rather than actually engaging with them. You just let them pass by. So you let these stressors just flow on through you, and they do, and they leave plenty of stress behind. But you don't notice that because you're blissing out. So it really is not an effective way of healing, but it is addictive, of course. And that's one of the things that's made it so popular. Because, if you have convinced yourself that you have to stay in an insupportable situation, there you are in your corporate job, you're being flogged by in all but the physical senses, by the people higher than you are in the hierarchy. You have to perform. You're constantly being criticized, constantly being put down, constantly. You have to do all of this extra work for which you're getting no additional pay. Your entire life is gurgling down the drain for the benefit of a bunch of the rich SOBs in the corner offices. If you convince yourself you have to do that, you can numb yourself to it with mindfulness meditation and just kind of keep on going. And you just let any troubling thought that surfaces just whiffle on by, and so it doesn't bother you. It's very convenient if you've convinced yourself you have to be a corporate drone. Now, there was, I forget which of the online humor mags it was, that were offering a helpful piece of advice for office workers. The best thing they can do to relieve their stress is to get up from the desk, walk out the door, and never come back. It was this hilarious little exercise article, and of course that's true, and a lot of people are doing that right now. That's one of the ways in which the way that the COVID epidemic was handled has turned out to be just stunningly an own goal for the corporate system. You shut everything down, you throw millions of people out of work, you let millions of other people work from home where they don't have the boss breathing down their neck all the time. And then after 2 years, you expect them all to come back and just pick up the way they were going. In the meantime, all those, many of those people you laid off have found other ways to make a living. They're not interested in coming back. And a lot of the people who were sitting at home have had time to sit and realize, I'm wasting my life. They're not coming back either. So, maybe that humor article had more of a point than its writers realized.
Well, we have a huge foundation now, and I guess to just segue basically into the swordsmanship, the basic question would be, who is this peculiar man, Gerard Thibault, and what exactly is the Academy of the Sword? Because ultimately, there isn't really. Is there anything like this been written? To be honest, since, because this is basically the most complex manual of swordsmanship ever
written in any language. Gerard Thibault was we call him Belgian nowadays. Belgium didn't exist as a country in his time. It was part of the Spanish Netherlands. But he was a young Belgian man. He had some kind of congenital health problem. I don't think anyone knows what. And his doctor advised him to take up fencing as a form of exercise. And he did. and he got fairly good at it. He studied with Lambert von Sommeren, who was one of the hot fencing teachers in Antwerp at that time. And then, because his family was in the wool trade, they were able to send him down to the south of France, to San Lucar de Barrameda, which was the center of Spanish rapier fencing at the time. And the Spanish system of fencing was very much into geometry. It did not look like Errol Flynn. It did not look like the sort of modern fencing. It was a very different thing. And Thibault handled it extremely well. He was very good at it. And when he came back to Antwerp, he came back to the Spanish Netherlands and to Holland and so on, which was, I believe, independent by then. He demonstrated that he was literally better than anyone else in the place. He did this. He did a demonstration before, I think it was Prince Maurice of Nassau, and cleaned the clocks of all of the best fencers in the Netherlands, and won first prize at a very prestigious tournament, just knocking people off right and left, and ended up with lots of students and lots of interest and plenty of funding from people like the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor and so on to write his book. Mm. So he wrote this book, which chronicles in incredible detail exactly how you practice this kind of fencing. Mm-hmm. And it's got a monomania for detail like nothing else I've ever seen. There's this geometrical pattern that shows exactly where each footfall goes. There are these ways of learning the amount of pressure to put on a sword that divides in I think it's 9 different divisions, and the sword itself is divided into 12 portions to tell you where it should cross the other guy's sword and so on. We're not just talking the fort and the foible here. It's very precise. And he just goes on for page after page after page of Alexander and Zachary. Those are the 2 characters that fight, and Zachary always ends up getting beaten and usually ends up dying horribly. By about step 6, there's a sword going through his skull or something charming like that. But it's an extraordinarily detailed thing. It is very heavily based on Renaissance geometrical thought. There's a lot of underlying sacred geometry. There are extended quotes from it from such at the time very very loaded sources as Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. And so that was the book that I stumbled across and got a microfilm copy from the British Library and translated.
So, is it overt that this is sacred geometry, or does Thibault sort of just say, "Look, this is just geometry"? And was it you? Was it you that noticed it, or was he talking to a silent? Do you think he was talking to an audience, a knowing audience?
He certainly, some of the audience knew, and that's why he included the quotes from Cornelius Agrippa and so on. There was definitely that sort of wink, wink, nod, nod here and there, but he never mentions occultism at any point. This was a time where that was not safe to do, and he was. We were talking about how Jung managed to play that game. Thibault played the same game in a different field. He played it brilliantly.
Mm-hmm. So I guess for those that don't know, just a quick overview. What exactly is sacred geometry?
Okay, sacred geometry is the use of geometry as a system of symbolism to express spiritual realities.
Well, there you go. You've practiced that line.
Exactly. Well, I've been asked that question many times. And Thibault was working with a particular... There are 2 broad categories of Western sacred geometry, the ad quadratum and the ad triangulum. And their practitioners occasionally got in fights with each other in, like, the building of cathedrals and so on. Thibault is very much ad quadratum. His mysterious circle is developed from a square. It uses the various square and square root of 2 geometries that unfold from that. If you have a background in sacred geometry, you're going to look at his mysterious circle and go, wow, this is cool. Because it includes a lot of meaning.
Mm-hmm. So let's, just to give, I guess, a rough approximation or rough idea, let's just to pose a question. Let's say, for instance, within Thibault's work here, you have to do steps A, B, C, and D, and in that sense that it's a sacred geometrical pattern. Would that, whatever you want to call that, still work if one didn't know of the sacredness of the act?
Apparently, yes.
Mm-hmm.
one of the reasons that I was able to get 2 successive contracts to publish this was that when I had the first 8 chapters written, I did a spiral-bound version of it and made it available by mail, just advertised in a few places. And people started taking the methods and practicing them and taking them to historical reenactment societies, and the Society for Creative Anachronism that we have over here, for example, and cleaning up the floor with people who had only learned sort of the vaguely modern fencing school of methods. They were extremely effective. And so it actually works. And these were people who did not have a noticeable grasp of the esoteric dimension. There are people teaching this stuff in schools these days. There are people who took up the book, or some of the other Spanish books also, and have done some amazing things with them.
Mm-hmm. And the foundation of this, I believe, is probably Pythagoras.
Pythagoras Pythagorean geometry as interpreted and understood by the geometers of the Renaissance.
Not simply basic secular mathematics.
No. Oh, no.
Okay. So I guess it's very difficult to expand upon the idea of this geometry, because this is why I wanted to have that foundation of the connection between matter and spirit, because this is exactly where this is happening. And so, in what sense, within these sacred geometric patterns, what is happening in this connection between matter and spirit?
What is happening is that from the Renaissance point of view, from the point of view of Renaissance Pythagoreanism, geometry, mathematics, is what mediates between spirit and matter. We were talking about the Western notion that the abstract mind is the pinnacle of existence. People in the Renaissance knew better. The mind is the midpoint. And so these abstract patterns enable spiritual forces to be embodied in the material world by way of movement, by way of position and posture, by way of a sword, which, a rapier, a straight line penetrating a surface. And if your geometry is correct, you survive, and the other guy does not.
Do you survive for tactical reasons, or reasons which are, we could say, above?
The two are not distinct within that system. Okay. The tactics unfold from the attunement of the geometry to spiritual realities.
So, extremely, I guess, difficult philosophical question. In what sense does this have connections to ideas of predestination or determinism and free will? In the sense of giving yourself over to, well, not giving yourself over, but being in tune with that something which is sacred, and therefore from that you live. Ultimately, for me, would put forth these big questions of how is that connected with free will and whether or not things are determined.
Well, in either it actually ducks the question, because on the one hand, if you attune yourself to those patterns, you were, if you were a determinist, you attune yourself to those patterns because you were destined to do so. On the other hand, if you believe in free will, you willingly attune yourself to the pattern better than the other guy, and so you live and he doesn't. And so it's very much as though here is a traffic sign. It says, bridge out ahead. Okay, there's no bridge there. If you continue driving this, your car is going to go into the river, and you're going to drown. Okay, here is an exit. The exit is also marked. Is it determinism or free will that you turn on that exit?
Either way, if I ask, what do you think?
My basic presupposition is that the human brain is about the size of a meatloaf and not much smarter than one. The universe is, umpty trillion light years. One of these cannot understand the other. We do not have the cognitive capacity to answer questions like the whole determinism and free will thing. We don't know yet. Maybe we will someday, but we don't. And rather than chasing our tails around like, an overexcited puppy, we can simply say, well, the universe appears to allow us a certain amount of free will and to impose a certain number of determinations. So somewhere in that middle ground, let's see what we can make happen. So it's kind of a pragmatic evasion of questions that we don't seem to be able to solve.
If only more people could just say, "I don't know." I think
Yes,
we live in a
yes.
better world. Even philosophers. Maybe that's why I like Wittgenstein so much, because he's trying, but really beneath his work all the time, he's saying, "Look, we're never really going to know, but here's a good shot." Same with Schopenhauer, I guess. All the ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Schopenhauer now and again fell victim to the conviction that he really had figured it out, and that's one of the weaknesses in his work. It can be salvaged very readily from that. You just have to say, "No, Arthur, have a beer." We don't know that.
So, the fact that this is such a peculiar relic, an object of history, this book, what role does it play today, if any, amidst those in the know of swordsmanship?
Okay, there are people who have taken up historical European martial arts as a martial arts practice for all the usual reasons. There are people who work with Thibault, with Thibault's system, or with other related systems of rapier fencing, in the same way that people pick up other martial arts weapons at a time when wars are fought with cruise missiles. What further might be possible with it? That's an interesting question. I felt that it was important to get it out there, to get it translated, and to get it into the hands of people who might be able to make good use of it. And I also felt that certainly the discipline of learning the geometrical dimensions of it and of working out the geometries was very useful to me in developing my understanding of sacred geometry. What else it might be being used for? Well, I don't have an elf on a shelf in each of the libraries bookshelves where people have these, and what they're doing with it is an interesting question. I hope they're doing something interesting.
And in Thibault's era in his day, with regards to swordsmanship, would most swordsmanship, and I guess the history of swordsmanship in general, would have had this deeper or divine foundation, or was this something that he clearly devised?
It really seems to have varied. There were always people for whom the warrior arts, however conceptualized, always had a spiritual foundation. You see that even in the sort of symbolism and the religious dimensions of knighthood in Europe, and organizations like the Knights Templar and so on that had this sort of religious concept of combat. But you also always had people who were simply, they wanted to know how to fight because they wanted to know how to fight, either because they wanted to win or because they wanted to keep someone else from killing them. And so we have, as with so many human things, we have a wide range, and people had then a very wide range of possibilities. From the grittiest, grottiest, most selfish and materialist reasons up to profound spiritual states. And you have your choice. You can approach swordsmanship from any of these angles, just as you can approach anything else from any of these angles. You can approach writing novels from the angles of what is going to make me a lot of money, and you can approach it from, I have something I want to say that I think is meaningful. I'm going to communicate it to the world, or anything in between, or off to various sides.
Are you planning on writing any more about swordsmanship, or is that something that?
I don't know. I don't have anything. I don't have my eyes on anything of the sort right now. I have a stack of other things to do, but it would be fun to do something else with swordsmanship in the future. It's always an entertaining field, and there is all of that memory of trashy fantasy novels in my childhood and brandishing, plastic swords as an 8-year-old.
Yeah, but it's odd to me. Maybe this is a silly thing to say, that so many people, it's probably back to Reichian character armor, right? So many people don't realize you can just go buy a sword and practice swordsmanship. It's one of those modern things, right? Well, we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, and yet people do. As with magic, there's a huge subculture of people who do things with swords, whether it's with Asian swords, with European swords, with all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of swords out there, and a lot of people who do practices with them, and who practice various traditions rooted in combat. waving around sharp pointy iron things. And so, as with magic, it's something that we don't do anymore, except that a lot of us do.
Yeah, is there anything you'd like to add about Swordsmanship or these two books that we haven't touched?
Well, one of the things that inspired me to get an interest in the martial arts, other than the 8-year-old trashy fantasy memories and watching too many reruns of Kung Fu in my misspent teen years, one of the advantages that martial arts have that most Western esoteric traditions don't is that it's very easy to discover who has actually been doing the work and who is simply a pompous blowhard. If you land a punch, it is very clear that a punch has been landed. If there is, if the two of you spar and one of you ends up flat on your back going, and the other one's going, what? I just tapped you. Somebody's been doing the work and somebody hasn't. In too much Western esotericism, we have a lot of people who are just, who make a big deal about being powerful mages, blah, blah, blah. And one suspects that in many cases they probably can't magic their way out of a wet paper bag. But how are you going to tell? So the great thing about martial arts is that they have a filter against certain kinds of stupidity. And that's one of the things I have tried to encourage. One of the reasons I've tried to encourage martial practices within Western esoteric spirituality, because it really does teach you that there is a difference between doing the work and just kind of play acting, role playing. And that, getting a fist when a fist lands on someone's face, it matters.
You can't avoid reality in that sense.
You can't avoid reality. And so that kind of reality testing is unfortunately not as common as it ought to be in the Western tradition, and I'd like to see much more of it.
So what are you working on at the moment?
Let's see. Right now I've got the second volume of a fiction series. I'm doing a series of basically occult detective novels. And the difference between them and the run-of-the-mill occult detective novels is that all of the magic and all of the spooky phenomena in them is real. It's all stuff that people do. And so it is not making for less suspense or what have you, but I'm having a great, serious fun time with that. Volume 1, The Witch of Criswell, is the title, will be out in the spring of next year. And Volume 2, The Book of Ha'atan, is currently underway. So I'm working on that. I'm working on another volume in the same series as The Way of the Golden Section and the Occult Philosophy Workbook. I'm working, and those are my two main projects right now. I've got a lot of little projects as well.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. The Spirit and the Sword. So both of these books are still available, or is the Spirit and the Sword?
They are still available, as far as I know.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for both of them in the description below.
Excellent. Thank you.
And it's been a pleasure once again. John Michael Greer.
As always.
This episode, I'm joined once again by writer John Michael Greer to discuss his book, The Spirit and the Sword, and Gerard Thibault's book, The Academy of the Sword, alongside discussions on Jung, Reich, Reichenbach, sacred geometry, the body, and more. I'd like to wish all my followers, subscribers, listeners, and patrons a Merry Christmas. And if you've enjoyed anything I've made this year and would like to support the podcast and gain access to some exclusive content, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy.